What's up, people? Dr. T. Hassan Johnson. Um, going to do a short little review of Creed 1 and 2. And, Creed, of course, coming out much later than when the whole series kind of starts. Creed comes out 2015, directed by Ryan Coogler, of course, starring Michael B. Jordan, Sylvester Stallone. Actually, one of the most creative kind of rebuilds of of a film, series I'd ever seen. Going from the original Rocky, and there were like six of those. You kind of got to a point where you never thought you'd see a Rocky, especially after the last one, which actually wasn't bad. The very last Rocky movie prior to Creed wasn't bad at all. It wasn't him, it was everything you think it's going to be, but actually good. For the most part, it was a good story. But Creed kicks off from there and ends up becoming something I just didn't see coming. And the reason I'm reviewing Creed 1 and 2 is because in regard to black males, it actually, especially, young black males, it actually was a very good film. Actually, it's a film series, in fact, because it deals with some elements that many boys are grappling with. So the first one with Ryan Coogler in 2015 was incredibly important because it starts out with this boy who would be, who will later as an adult be played by Michael B. Jordan, but this boy named Adonis Creed. And Adonis is the son of Apollo Creed, who dies in I think it's Rocky 4. Yeah, he dies in Rocky.
I cannot be defeated.
Okay. Somebody get him back down there!
There is no movement by Creed.
To the right over!
I defeat all that.
Get out of here! It's absolute pandemonium. Stand back. We let him be.
You can do it, Sword. I defeat the real champion.
Where's the stretcher? Somebody sent for us in. Let him breathe, for God's sake!
What started out as a joke has turned out to be a descent.
Creed appears to be in very serious condition.
The man alive!
You can make it fun. If he dies, he dies.
Four back in the 1980s. So, to see him, to see that character being referenced was still kind of a big deal for me because I grew up watching Rocky movies. So there's, I'm a little biased having watched them at a young age. There are things that I probably like about it that I wouldn't if I never grown up watching them. But nevertheless, I think having this new series was very interesting. So you have Adonis, who his father Apollo, who was Rocky's best friend and his nemesis in the first two Rocky movies, he dies in Rocky 4 back in the 1980s. And what they end up saying is that he actually had an extramarital affair, had a child out of wedlock with a woman that we'd never seen on the screen. So the first time we really see Adonis, he's in a youth facility because he's always in trouble for fighting, which is more than understandable when you have a boy who has neither parent, not just no father, has neither parent. His mother died, after his father. And so, as a matter of fact, he never even met his father. So he's already angry as a kid. And he's constantly fighting, constantly in trouble. As a matter of fact, when the film starts in the youth facility, he's fighting. And he gets put in a detention hold, right? And I will admit, watching it for the first time, I started to tear up. I welled up within the first few minutes of the film because what Coogler did that was so brilliant, and he to kind of add a level of emotional resonance with the film, is the camera pans through the hallway, if I'm not mistaken, of the detention hold area. And all you can see is this slit on each door. And you see this young black male's face looking out of every single door. And that shit moved me. It moved me. And then, of course, Adonis is in that cell, by himself. And in walks Felicia Rashad, who I did not expect to see in a Rocky series movie. But it was actually brilliant because she plays Marianne Creed, who is Apollo's wife. a widow, right? So she was married to Apollo. They actually did have kids together, but they never brought those kids into the Creed series. But she goes out of her way to find Adonis. Now, you got to put this together in your mind. Her husband has cheated on her, had a child out of wedlock, dies in the ring fighting, which was something that he had already retired from and she really didn't want him to do. He decided to go back in because he missed the fanfare of the fights, but in doing so, dies. And so she reaches out to this boy whose mother has also died. I think she died from drug use. And she takes him in and raises him. Now, if that ain't some old school womanhood right there, you know what I mean? She loved her husband enough, despite the pain he caused, to raise the child that he had out of wedlock. Damn. But she also recognized the boy didn't have anything to do with that. He never met his father and his mother died early. So she takes him in. And I will say it's brilliantly played by Felicia Rashad because she's not overly emotional. She's in the sense that, you know, the way one might be with their own biological child, because the circumstances of his birth, I think, has some like permanent impact with her. She doesn't hate him. She doesn't mistreat him. She's just very kind of reserved. Now, that could be very well the personality of the character, but in my assessment, I think for her, this is a woman who loved the husband that she lost, and that love extended to his child, and she took him in as her own, but there's always the kind of stain of how it happened. So she's very kind of reserved with him, even though she's loving enough to raise him and care for him. He doesn't want for anything the whole time she raises him. And so we immediately see her going into the cell. He thinks she's another social worker, which is kind of understandable. But she explains that she's not a social worker and that she's interested in taking him in, and she does. And the next time we see him from there, he's an adult. And what we're finding is that he's going down to Mexico and fighting in these kind of under the table, I don't know if they're illegal per se, but they're definitely not, sanctioned, bouts. But he goes out there to fight. He goes to Mexico to fight and to box. And yet has a corporate job at the same time. He's well educated, has been well taken care of, is smart, well spoken, and definitely had just gotten a promotion at work. So basically that's there to say that if he wants to live his life, along those terms, he'd do well, and he chooses to box instead. And he goes to the ring of that his father was known for, the boxing, not the ring, but the gym that his father was known for boxing in. And the manager there, who is the son of the man who managed his father, refuses to train him because he tells him that in terms of boxing, all these guys, this is all they have, and you're kind of this rich kid with a degree. You don't really want this, which of course infuriates Adonis because he tries to show that he's got as much drive as anybody there. He grew up in foster homes by himself, up until Marianne took him in. So, that ends up, kind of leading to him getting knocked out by the number 2 boxer in the world at that time, which is not too shabby. He knocks somebody out, and then he challenges everybody in the ring, and the number 2 guy happens to walk in and happens to beat him in that instance, which comes back in the second one. So we'll get back to that. So anyway, from there, he takes it upon himself to go to Philadelphia and to look up Rocky. And he uses Rocky kind of as a proxy in some respects for his father. Because not only was Rocky a good friend of his father's, not only did they have this legacy of boxing against and with each other, Rocky's also kind of responsible for Apollo's death. Apollo wanted to fight. He didn't want Rocky to throw in the white towel. And because Rocky didn't, Apollo dies in the ring. So Rocky holds himself accountable for that and responsible for it. And he's never quite gotten over it. And so that's what Adonis uses to get Rocky's support. He kind of plays on, I am the son of Apollo and you owe me, while at the same time trying to find some connection with his father through Rocky. So this film, the first one, is very much related to fathers. Well, both creeds are related to the whole notion, the whole idea of fathers and sons. but especially the first one, because he's trying to have some kind of connection with his father through people that knew him. He already grew up with Marianne. Now he's going to Rocky. And so eventually Rocky signs on to train him. And from there, he learns a lot about manhood from, working out. And again, he's focusing on the boxing ring and what he's learning as a way of really dealing with himself. And Rocky's very kind of straightforward with him about that. He tells him at one point, looking in the mirror, he said, that's your greatest enemy. That's your greatest obstacle, is yourself. So when you get in the ring to fight somebody, it's not about you and the other person. It's about you getting out of your own way, right? You're your biggest impediment. If you lose in a fight, you lose. If you win, you win. But if you get in your own way, you lose either way. You know what I mean? So can you be courageous enough to overcome your own fear? Can you be courageous enough to put your insecurities and doubts to the side and focus on what you've trained yourself to do? And what does that do for you? Well, it develops you, not only in terms of whatever craft you've chosen, but it develops you as a man, right? Because a man, in terms of what's socially projected, is, we have to protect and provide, right? That's the social agreement. And we can have an argument about whether or not that social agreement is broken, where women still expect you to provide and protect, but don't return what used to be returned in that dynamic: respect, affection, feminine attention and resources, not resources, but companionship. We can definitely have a conversation about whether or not those things are returned, because that was the old school agreement, right? The old school agreement was that men protect and provide, women provided feminine companionship, as well as affection and nurturing, so on and so forth. So it was an exchange of certain types of resources. And we know through feminism and through the material support that feminism extended, women no longer felt the need to have to provide that, because now they had a certain amount of access from the state, which is true. But there's still this expectation that when women deal with men, that they still expect to be protected and provided for in a particular way. Now, we talk about that monetarily, and there's a debate about whether or not women actually need it, but we don't talk about it emotionally. We don't talk about the way men are still expected to serve as the rock, the foundation, for a relationship in a particular way. You're expected to be consistent. You're not only expected to succeed at whatever it is you're doing, but you're also expected to be consistent and to not give in to whimsy, fanciful thoughts, or emotionalism. You're expected to be consistent, you're reliable, and to overcome whatever obstacles are put in front of you. Well, in doing so, what you see with Rocky is, in this film, is precisely the foundation of that attitude. What men have to develop in themselves to be able to exude that kind of consistency, stability, and focus that men actually provide in relationships and in families. So again, we're using the ring as a way to do that. I talked about this with Kobe Bryant's Muse, where Kobe used the court. In this context, Adonis Creed uses the ring. And Rocky's guidance is really a trial by fire, or an initiation into manhood, right? Now, he's already made some significant steps. He's made some decisions to stand on his own, but it's the consistency, it's the focus, it's the drive, it's the courage of, moving past your own fear and accomplishing a set out goal. These are the things that he actually learns from Rocky. And this is one of the ways that Rocky as a character has been kind of articulated. He's this, scrappy underdog. He's not the strongest or biggest thing in the world, but he's got this, this iron will, right? And that iron will is symbolic of manhood, right? So this is what Adonis comes to Rocky to get. How do you develop this iron will? And that's really what you see happening in the first film, where you see Rocky imparting to him how to do this, almost as a penance to be paid for Apollo's death. And at the same time, this is the will that Apollo himself had, because in the very, very first Rocky movie in the late 1970s, Apollo beats Rocky. In the second one, Rocky comes back and beats him. In the third one, Rocky fights Mr. T's character, Clubber Lang, and Apollo actually trains him to fight, because he actually loses at first and then comes back and wins. because of Apollo's training, right? So again, Adonis coming to Rocky is almost like a penance, but also a repayment for what Apollo did for Rocky back in the 80s, fighting Mr. T. And then, of course, in the fourth film, Apollo dies in the ring with Dolph Lundgren's character, Ivan Drago, which we'll get to in a minute when we talk about the second one. And, even though he's dead, it's this desire to avenge Apollo that drives Rocky's will in that one. The fifth one I don't really pay much attention to. It's Rocky losing all his money, going back to Philadelphia, living a working class life, and contemplating training another fighter who ends up just being a thug. And so Rocky ends up fighting him. It's one of the throwaway films, but the one after that, Rocky 6, is actually pretty good, where you see him as an older man navigating his life, trying to define his relationship with his son, so on and so forth. And his son is not a boxer, so they actually have a very tense, strange relationship that they got to work out. And Rocky's trying to deal with unresolved feelings about his wife dying, Adrian, and what to do about that. So by the time we get to Creed, Creed brings in this whole other element where you owe this debt to this boy you've never met before who lost his father because of you. And so Rocky's dealing with the working through the guilt of that. And then in this film too, we find out he has cancer. So the two end up working together to overcome both cancer and the boxing and really trying to progress in that way. And so the film becomes a testament to manhood in young adulthood, but manhood also from a position of whether you can take it a couple ways. You can take it in terms of elders, older men like Rocky having to now fight a whole new challenge, or you could take it in terms of cancer, right? But either way, there's multiple levels that the first film deals with. Manhood, deals with achieving goals, deals with will and consistency and tenacity and overcoming adversity. You see those elements constantly being drilled in, and it's important that they are. And Ryan Coogler understands this because these are actually the building blocks of manhood, right? So Coogler's not only the director, and if you don't know, Ryan Coogler's the same guy that ended up directing the first Black Panther movie. He also did the film on Oscar Grant, Fruitvale Station, with Michael B. Jordan on the life of Oscar Grant, who was killed in Oakland at the hands of a security guard. Very powerful film, and they deal really well in that film. I might do a review of that one. They deal with black manhood in that one as well. But Coogler ends up being one of the writers for this as well, and I think the way they put this together was beautifully done because the lessons about manhood remain consistent. Right. He also meets his love interest, played by Tessa Thompson, Bianca, who's a singer. And this is actually one of the more interesting love interests that I've seen in a while, because she is a very talented singer who's fairly beautiful, very kind of hard to get next to, but you also find out she's dealing with her own demons, her own difficulties, and one of those is that she's going deaf. So you imagine a woman who loves to sing, loves to entertain, but she is from day to day losing her hearing, right? And apparently it's a hereditary disease, so if she has a child, it's still a concern. And so she's dealing with that while he's trying to get to know her, and it's a multi-layered film in many respects. Reconciling, there are points where there are tensions between Adonis and Rocky that are really tensions between Adonis and his father Apollo. And Rocky actually deals with this in a very fatherly way. When I say fatherly, it's a different type of fatherhood. It's the fatherhood of a man who's advising you, who isn't your father, but has decided to impart something to you in this way. And so he does it in a very powerful way. There's a scene where Adonis has yet again gotten into another fight. He's allowed his anger to get the best of him. He's in jail, and Rocky comes to see him. And at one point, he's so frustrated with Rocky that there's even a threat that things might get physical. And yet, in that moment, Rocky doesn't really respond to that. He doesn't really, he doesn't, shoulder up. He doesn't expect to be hit. He doesn't expect to fight back. He just dismisses all of that, and he talks straight to Adonis in the midst of Adonis's tantrum. And he said, "I don't really think this is about me." And I'm paraphrasing. I'm not giving away the whole scene, but I mean, he lets him know, "You're not really mad at me. You're mad at somebody else who really can't defend himself. And that was such a powerful moment, because one of the things that our boys have to learn is the art of detachment. And there's a lot to go with detachment that I'm not going to go into now, but the dimension of it I'm speaking to right now is the importance of being able to separate how you feel about a given situation from what's really happening. What your own motivations really are versus what you're telling other people they are. Detachment has to do with getting to the reality of something by really detaching from all of the things, the attachments we associate with them, right? So, random example that has nothing to do with the film. You know, what would be a good way to put it? If I'm trying to live up to, you know, let's say I'm Michael Jordan's son, and I really don't know about anything about his son, so I'm not speaking about them directly, but, you know, let's just say for the sake of argument, I'm Michael Jordan's son, and I'm trying to be the best basketball player in the world, and I'm killing myself to do it, but I don't have anywhere near the talent, but I'm still killing myself to do it in an unhealthy way. But I at some point have to come to grips with the fact that the only reason I'm doing it is not because I love basketball. It's not even because I want to be the best. It's because I want to live up to other people's ideas of what I'm supposed to be as Jordan's son. The attachment for me there would be other people's ideas. And so the challenge is, can I let go of my concern about other people's wants and desires and actually just focus on the reality? And what is the reality? The reality is I'm killing myself to do something that I'm really not very good at, no matter how hard I work. And I really don't even have a love for. And if that's the case, what kind of decision do I need to make in my life based on the reality of life rather than the perception of what things should be based on other people's feelings and thoughts? You know what I'm saying? So in that regard, our boys often need to learn how to separate out their emotions, separate out their aspirations, and anything associated with what they're doing from what it actually is. And this is what happens with Rocky and Adonis. You know, getting to the bottom of Adonis's frustration. Is it really about the situations he's in where he's constantly fighting over and over and over again? Or is it about a frustration that really goes back to his father, right? And can you get all of these extra things out of the way and focus on letting go of the frustration with your father? Especially if you have no opportunity to work that out. You can't sit down with your father because he died. You know what I mean? You have to find a way to let go of it. Now, you got to do it anyway, whether the father's alive or not in your life. You still got to let go of it. But it's that much harder for a young Adonis whose father was never there. He's never met him. How do you let go of something that you can't resolve? And so he has to come to grips with that. And he even says later in the film, coming to grips with the fact that he wasn't an accident. And that's really his major issue in the film. Proving to the world, that he wasn't an accident. And he actually works this out in the ring, but it is the process of detaching. He had to let go of this idea that he needed to prove anything. And that can be really hard to do. Now, I can tell you right off, the culmination of every Rocky film is the final fight in the end. And most of the films are kind of formulaic, but the tongue-in-cheek joke with Rocky movies is, it's coming. It's going to come. And yet the way it's done can still be moving if you're paying attention, right? So it's not that it's a big surprise and you don't know which way it's going to go. You actually know how the whole movie is going to go, but the way they execute it is what brings out the humanity in the dialogue, humanity in the story. So in this instance, he's fighting the number one champion in the world. He doesn't have anywhere near as much experience, but because of a bunch of circumstances, he manages to get this fight with the number one champ in the world. And I won't say what the final end result was, but I will say this much. There is a point where he gets knocked out. And I can tell you that for the second time in this film, my eyes welled up. Because once he was knocked out, they show you what goes through his mind while he's completely out. And he sees his adopted mother, Marianne. He sees Rocky grappling with cancer. He sees Bianca, this, girlfriend figure that he's not quite been able to resolve things with. You know, he sees all of these various people. But the image he sees when he's finally ready to get up is the image of his father, right? Apollo Creed. And Apollo doesn't say anything. It's actually an old image. It's an old video clip from one of Rocky's, I would say from Rocky 1 or 2. It's like from one of the original Rocky movies. And, you know, they show you early in the film, he's watched all his father's fights over and over again, you know, ad nauseum. So as he's laying there unconscious, he sees his father's face. Now, his father's actually boxing. He's in the ring. And he's got this, you know, this look on his face, this look of strength, this look of fire, this look of intensity, this look of competition. He sees his father. And it comes across almost like a message, like, get up. You know what I mean? And so what you see there is this kind of link between father and son. And sometimes men can share with one another, which is that warrior spirit. I remember there's an episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine that moves me every time I see it, because it's actually this scene where Worf, you know, the Klingon on the show, is captured, and he and one of his other Klingon compatriots are being set to constantly fight these aliens over and over again, hand-to-hand combat. And at one point, Worf's boy is really trying to commit suicide. He really wants to stop fighting. And he said at one point, Worf looked at him and gave him his warrior spirit. And so he had to fight. That's kind of what you see happening here with Adonis and his father, Apollo. Even though Apollo's long dead, he sees the image of his father fighting, and it gives him back his warrior spirit. And it's incredibly moving, especially if you've ever experienced it, because it is a very sacred, special thing that men do share. And we often don't talk about it, but it is what it is. And this is one of the reasons that men love sports. It's one of the reasons that men love, you know, the competition, because at the end of the day, when you see a man embody that warrior spirit and accomplish over incredible odds, it reaffirms, you know, anyone's masculinity who is recognizing what's happening there, right? It's, you know, so I would say in many ways, sports, it can be a celebration of masculinity, but not for the reasons other people think. It's not just about raw bravado or fighting or whatever. It's actually about overcoming odds, overcoming fear, and, you know, and growing into your warrior spirit to make those things happen. And that's what you see here. So it's a testament to manhood in many ways. And it's one that others will make fun of or really take for granted, not appreciate the depth and importance of. But for young men, and men in general, but for young men especially, it's crucial. It's crucial to appreciate the value of that warrior spirit and what it can do in your life. Because it's not just in sports or at a given moment making the winning shot for a game. That's not what it is. That's how we see it symbolized. But it can be the warrior spirit that makes the difference in terms of me going out to work every day to support my family, or making an ambitious move, business decision that other people would shy away from. But I got the warrior spirit to kind of take that leap and see what I can make of it. And you know, what it can do, not only for the family, but for my own spirit and for the spirit of my sons. If they see me do it, take that chance and make it happen. Even in the loss, if you make that kind of the decision and it doesn't work, for people to see, for your sons especially, to see how you pick up from your failure and do so with dignity, you know, and an unbowed head. You know what I mean? Even if it means going and finding, you know, some kind of job or whatever until you can get on your feet again. The point is, regardless of whatever decision you make, how important it is for your sons to see you handle success or failure with a warrior spirit and dignity. And that becomes how our manhood is passed on. They watch every move you make. So, you know, that's what I think we see here with Creed. Now, I'm not going to spend as long on Creed 2, even though I think it's a worthy follow-up. Now, Creed 2 comes out in 2018, 3 years later. Same characters are involved, although behind the camera, it's directed by Stephen Capel Jr., and it's not directed by Ryan Coogler, the way the first film was. Coogler is still one of the writers in the film, which I think you can kind of see because there's a continuity there. So at the beginning of this, we see Adonis continuing to fight with Rocky as his trainer. He wins the championship and he beats the number 2 guy that knocked him out in the beginning of the first Creed movie. And actually, there's another component to it because he bet his car, his Mustang, which ended up being the only thing he ever had from his father. He bet it, he lost it to the number 2 guy, and in this first fight in Creed 2, he fights for the number 1 spot for the championship, and his father's car is on the line. So we get to see his growth as a fighter since the first movie. We get to see the growth with his relationship with Bianca. He wants to propose toward the beginning of the film, so you could see that relationship going to another level. And then from there, they end up getting pregnant, and dealing with this whole question of Bianca's condition, and whether or not their child inherits this, and they do. The child actually does inherit the hearing condition, and from there they have to grapple with how do we manage this. Now, the biggest dimension to this film, though, is the return of Dolph Lundgren's character Ivan Drago, and his son, played by Florian Munteanu. I think I may have mispronounced that, but Munteanu, who plays Victor Drago, Ivan's son. Now, so for those who may not have watched the entire series, the original Rocky IV, I want to say it was made in the late 80s. In that film, that's the film Apollo Creed dies, and Ivan Drago is the big bad guy from Russia that Rocky has to fight to avenge the death of Apollo. Well, in this film, they bring Ivan back, and he was disgraced after his loss to Rocky. His wife left him, and in the meantime, he has this son that he raises on his own. And they live a very hand-to-mouth kind of working existence in poverty in Russia. But Victor Drago is an accomplished fighter. He's vicious. He doesn't have a lot of experience, but he's vicious. He's huge. He's fast. He's muscular. He's everything Ivan was in the first movie. And so you get to see the next level of that taking place here. And they decide, mostly Ivan, to use Apollo's death to bait Adonis into fighting Victor, so Victor can get his career off the ground. And it works, right? They just come in, get on television, make some sly statements to kind of goad Adonis into fighting Victor simply off the name of his father. And of course, in this instance, Rocky doesn't want to train him for that fight, and Adonis and Rocky have a falling out over that. And you get to see in the first fight what happens with Adonis and Victor. And then from there, a broken Adonis has to work his way back. Now, again, if you've seen Rocky movies, this tends to happen. It's a paradigm. And like I said a moment ago, it's not that the Rocky movies are going to surprise you story-wise. It's really more how they execute what you already know is coming. And, anybody that's played sports or has boxed or has done martial arts can tell you, you can know what's coming, and that doesn't change the fact that you still get knocked out. You know what I mean? Some fighters can tell you what they're going to do to you and do it and still handle you. So just like that with certain Rocky movies, you may know what's going to happen, but it doesn't necessarily change the fact that the story can still be good, And so in this instance, whether you like it or not, I think there's still some very important things that can be learned here. The relationship between Adonis and his father is still a factor in the sense that now he's not grappling with unresolved anger toward his father. He's grappling with defending and avenging his father, right? So the man who killed his father has trained his own son to fight him. And so he feels like there's this kind of family rivalry that he has to stand up for that Rocky doesn't want to be any part of. And so after really kind of being broken, and in the midst of his brokenness, having a child who's dealing with disabilities, he's at his bottom. And he has to work his way up from there. And we see this, as we do with most Rocky movies, manifested in, the famous workout montage that every Rocky movie is famous for. But it's still inspiring nonetheless, because you see him having to rebuild himself from nothing to put himself in the kind of mind state he needs to be in to win this fight. And that, I think, is one of the most important lessons about Creed 2. That sometimes we face adversity in such a manner that we have to put ourselves in an entirely different mind state to overcome it. This is where we go back to Kobe Bryant's muse and the development of the Black Mamba mind state. It's the same principle. This is what Adonis learns from Rocky, where he has to learn how to become something he's never been in order to face this particular challenge. And I think that is a very important element in manhood development, right? Again, it goes back to goal setting, it goes back to prioritizing, it goes back to discipline, it goes back to all of that, but it adds another element that is figuring out what it's actually going to take to accomplish this goal and becoming that, right? Transforming oneself into what you need to accomplish the goal set in front of you. And that is yet another trait of manhood, right? Becoming what you need to become to accomplish this goal. Not what you feel like becoming, not what you want to become, not what you want to become on some days, but actually goal setting to the degree where you say, okay, in order for me to accomplish this goal, which for Adonis was beating Victor, I have to become this thing. And what I need to do to become that thing, I can't compromise on. And this is the spirit that men have to learn at a young age. And it's especially important that they learn it from men who know what that is. Not every man does. But if you've ever dealt with a man who has become something beyond his capacities to accomplish a goal, it's a lesson you never forget. And it's those men that can impart it to those coming up behind them, right? I did the same thing, just in a non-athletic way. I didn't know anybody with a PhD. I never met anybody with a doctorate until I got to college. I met teachers, but I didn't know them personally. I had to become something I never fathomed existed in order for me to accomplish this goal of becoming a professor. Well, it's the same thing. It's just in this film, it's symbolized in this boxing match. But again, what we do with all of these films is we try to take the lessons out of them that our sons are being entertained by and pull the deeper lesson out of it that they can apply to their own life. And so one of those lessons is becoming more than what you are to accomplish a said goal. Right? I think there are 3 fights in this movie. Each one, I think, offers something that all have to do with prioritizing and goal setting. And there's even, again, these stories are written in a very nuanced way in a certain respect, because even Drago, Victor, the son, has something to grapple with himself. One, he's never lost. So he's not used to dealing with adversity in the ring. He's used to dominating whoever he's with. So the first time he runs up against a challenge, and we've seen this with boxers in real life, boxers that are known for wiping people out in a ring or two, in a round or two, when they finally deal with somebody that can match them, then the challenge becomes, how long can you go? And if you've never had to before, it's difficult to develop the stamina. So here's the lesson to pull out of that. The losses, the failures that Adonis suffers that Victor doesn't and never has actually become tools for Adonis to use. And this is what Rocky kind of shows him how to do. And yeah, you have to some extent this white savior dynamic happening, but you know, as much as you need to point out the white savior dynamic for the well-being of your son, also pull out the deeper lesson about the values of manhood. But anyway, I digress. What he gets, so Victor is grappling with his own issues, and one of them is because he's never lost, he hasn't really been challenged. Adonis has lost a lot, and in so doing, he is able to know how far to go. He knows what the distance is. But if you've never lost and you've never been challenged, the first time you get taken there, you're barely holding on. And so I think that ends up, so in that way, I'm saying Adonis is able to turn his failures into a plus. And Victor's successes become a handicap, right? But the second thing we notice with Victor too is that, as I said in the first movie, his father Ivan loses his wife because he loses the fight to Rocky. She's kind of a gold digger, but not just for money and cash, but also for status and notoriety. So she gets, as hypergamy dictates, with the most successful, usually a politician or whatever. So in this particular film, once Victor has begun to really win, the Russian aristocracy kind of takes to him and tries to back him up, which infuriates Victor, which is interesting, because this is all Ivan ever wanted, to be respected and lauded by the aristocracy. And once he failed, they dropped him, and he lived in poverty. When he sees his son able to achieve the same thing, which is really what he's been pushing for, he's ecstatic. And so at this dinner with all of these diplomats and aristocrats, in walks his mother, being married to what is presumably the most powerful one, aristocrat in the room. And she just kind of says, "Hey, Victor," like it's nothing. And Victor storms out, which slightly embarrasses her. But he storms out because, as he states when he gets into an argument with his father Ivan, he says, "This is the woman that left you. She left us." And he's furious about this. And Ivan puts it all on himself, as men tend to do. And he says, no, it's not. He doesn't really point out anything about her leaving. He says, "I lost." As if to say, my loss in the ring justified why she left and why we had nothing. And the fact that you're going to win is what makes it all worth it. Now, Victor doesn't necessarily associate boxing with success the way his father does. In many ways, I suspect he associates boxing with his father. And if he can do well, that's the closest thing to love he can get from his father. So they have very different focuses. Ivan's focus was on success based on boxing. Victor's focus is his father and gaining his father's approval, which is important, right? Our sons seek out our approval. And we have to be able to only extend it when they've earned it, right? That's the challenge of manhood. In many ways, the differences between fathers and mothers is that mothers' jobs are to impart, especially at a very young age, unconditional love, right? This is very affirming to a child, to know that they are unconditionally loved no matter what they do. A father's task is different. Ours is more about conditional love. You want my affirmation? You want my approval? Earn it. Demonstrate that you can learn these tools of manhood. That doesn't mean you have to be cold and heartless, but it does mean, as a father, that your sons have to know that when it comes to fatherhood, that is, as is manhood, something that is won, something that is achieved. Now, here's the thing. Fathers love their children, simply, we love our children. There's no question about that. Whether your child succeeds or not. But our approval is a different matter. Our approval is based on, what you're willing to put forth to achieve as a son. And I think we see that here in certain instances. Now, it's done in a kind of toxic way in terms of Ivan and Victor, but it is a factor in father-son relationships. It's not about love. The love is there. But the expression of that love is very different between fathers and sons versus mothers, right? Fathers are very much about conditional love. And the lesson there is that if you really want to achieve in life, you have to go out and make it happen, right? So the mother at a young age, affirms the child in their development with unconditional love. Fathers affirm a young man into manhood with conditional love. Right, and that's the way those things are supposed to bounce off one another. Period of time where the child is affirmed through unconditional love, and then a period of child where a young man becomes a man through earning it, most particularly his father's approval. Right, traversing difficulties, adversity, and achieving that manhood based on a demonstration of will, skill, and whatnot. So those kind of skills, the relationship between mother and father and the child's development is predicated on that bouncing back and forth. Now, in the black community, 80% of our kids nearly are raised in single parent households, and that doesn't mean that fathers are not in their lives, but it is a factor in terms of father presence. And so it becomes important that if men are going to take on a woman's children as their own, if she had them before you met, or things of that nature, the question becomes, is there anybody in this child's life that is playing that role? And if you're going to play it, is that something you can do with this particular child? But just understanding the way conditional love, for the sake, not conditional love, conditional affirmation. Well, they call it conditional love, but I want to separate out here that we love our children anyway. It's not that we don't. The term conditional love or conditional affirmation merely speaks to the demonstration of that love for the sake of the child's development. A little different. So it's not a question of mothers loving children and fathers not. Both parents love their children, or can. There are instances where that's not the case. But in a normal circumstance, both parents love the child, but the way they interact with the child for the child's sake is a little different. And they play two different roles to accomplish that. And once that child accomplishes their manhood, relationship between the father and son changes. It goes from being top-down disciplinarian, coach, challenger, to, one being disciplined student, challengee. It changes from that to more like a friendship. And the older the child becomes, where they become a man and they become an adult, and the father, you really transition into a friendship over time. But that's something that happens more so into adulthood. But that friendship doesn't really begin to develop until after the son has achieved manhood. Until that point, right, the father plays the role of pushing the son into finding himself and overcoming adversity, right? So that said, that part of it is still there, and we see this with Drago. So I was saying it was well written to the extent that everybody had a challenge. Right? Nobody was one-dimensional. Everybody had something they were grappling with, and you got to see that play out in the last fight, where Victor, deals with his mother, and they never engage each other directly, but you could see the pain of that relationship kind of come to the forefront, as well as you can see what Adonis learns about pain, and Rocky teaches him how to process pain differently, right? How to process pain differently and use it as a tool, which is another useful tactic that coaches in the military use. I mean, when it comes to martial training or the training of boys, it's very different than what we see in women's spaces, and even mainstream education, which is overwhelmingly feminine because majority of teachers are women. What boys get in male spaces is very different. It comes out of the martial tradition, like martial arts, certain types of male athletic sports, and the military training. It's very much based on competition. It's very much based on overcoming adversity. It's based on discipline and consistency and tenacity and goal setting and prioritizing, and this is one of the more important factors: overcoming pain. Right? Learning how to develop a different relationship to pain. And this is something you can see in every Rocky movie when it comes to the workout montage. Becoming comfortable with pain to the point where you no longer see pain as an impediment. You see it as a necessity. You see it as a tool to get where you want. And that's that warrior mind state as well. It's not just about dealing with an adversary. It's also about dealing with the adversary within yourself, but also navigating your fear of pain and removing that. And so from there, the relationship with pain is one where it can become a tool. And so if you don't understand what I'm saying, you haven't seen the movie, when you watch the last fight, you see where Rocky's training of Adonis to process pain differently becomes an asset to Adonis. Whereas Victor is not really used to pain because he hasn't had to deal with it. So anyway, that becomes important. There are some racial elements. I mean, Victor and Ivan are these Nordic, white figures, highly masculine and very, developed physically and aggressive and so on and so forth. So there are these undertones of superiority and inferiority. And this even goes back to Rocky IV with Apollo dying at the hands of Ivan Drago. Ivan was much bigger, much larger, much stronger. He's this pure Aryan idea, whereas you have this black, retired Apollo Creed who gets killed in the ring. So there's this suggestion that white masculinities are more powerful than black. And then, that kind of reoccurring idea coming back into Creed 2. And so when you see, Adonis dealing with Victor early in the film, there are elements of this notion of white superiority that play out. It's not something that's purposely and outwardly discussed, but it's there. And so, seeing Creed deal with that, especially in the second fight, there are some racial overtones being, in terms of the statements about superiority, about what is superiority, who is actually superior, and why, and whether or not that superiority speaks to a racial level or whether it speaks to becoming a man in your own mind. All of those elements kind of come to bear by the time we get to the third fight of the film, which is the last fight between Adonis and Victor. So that is there. I'm not sidestepping that. But again, I watch movies on multiple levels. So in one vein, I can identify something I find offensive, but in another vein, I can find a deeper lesson, and I try to talk to my son about both because I want him to be able to look at the world multidimensionally, not just in terms of what I like or what I think will make you feel good, but even in something that you find offensive, can you find a deeper lesson into it that makes you stronger, right? So I want him to develop that kind of mind state. So, those are some things that I think might be useful in Creed 1 and 2. Make a marathon of it. Sit down with your son and watch them. Hell, you could actually watch most of the Rocky movies, but if you're concerned about the racial overtones of whiteness, Italianness versus blackness, because that's something we see in the first two movies, or three movies, is Rocky beating up on black men and winning. He loses in the first one, but by the time you get to the second and third, he's beating up on black men pretty regularly. The fourth and fifth movies, he's fighting other white men who are actually considered more purely white than he. Right? In the fourth and fifth movies, he's fighting these blonde-haired, blue-eyed, larger, more aggressive, physically assertive white men. And there's a statement there about Italianness and European whiteness. Italians are not considered or weren't considered white, as were the Irish and other groups. Or Jews. They weren't considered white. They actually became white over the 20th century, in at least in North America. Right. That said, the overtones, or I should say the undertones really, of Rocky movies from Rocky IV onward were about Italianness becoming white, in my assessment. Right? If you look at the poster for the fourth movie, he's draped in an American flag. And even though he's more tan than Dolph Lundgren's Ivan Drago, he's still white. And so by the time he ends, his Americanness becomes the center focus, which in many ways is symbolic of his whiteness. This is why the Creed series is so important, because he goes from proving his whiteness. So he starts out beating up black men, or starts out losing to them, then winning over them, then winning over Nordic whites. And now he's working with a young black male whose life he's really responsible for having ruined. And so there's some different directions it takes, and I credit Coogler with a lot of that. I credit Coogler with that. I don't think this was a film that, one, would have been made without Coogler, and two, wouldn't have been made with this kind of nuance to black manhood without Coogler. So I credit him with that. Anyway, those are the elements that I see, and I want my son to develop that kind of multidimensional focus where he can both hate something and learn from it at the same time, or he can love something and learn from it at the same time, or be indifferent to something but still learn from it at the same time. That's my question to him. What else do you see beyond the surface? Can you go deeper? What are the patterns that you see? What are the statements being made? What do you think are the undertones of the story, right? Regardless of what the story is, what's being said. Are men weaker than women? Are they less intelligent and less capable? Are black men less capable than white men? What are the undertones to what's being communicated in this film? Right? So, I hope you were able to get something for that. Apologize for it being so long, but that was Creed 1 and 2. Peace.